Well, good afternoon. This is Pastor Jim Taylor from Haven Baptist Church in sunny Kunsan in South Korea, and I am about to record a session on Your Questions Answered. And if you have any questions, please send them to me. You can text them to me. You can email them to me, whatever you want to do. And I'll add those to my list. I've got quite a list. I have one Haven alumni out there that probably sends me a question a day at the very least. And that's fine. I'll get to them all at some point. But anyway, today's is on what is happening in Ezekiel chapter 8. So the question came, can you explain what's occurring in Ezekiel 8 and what should I know? Well, I don't want to read the whole chapter to you because it's kind of long, but I hope you have your Bible there and you can refer to it as I'm going through the session on Ezekiel 8 here. But we're given a date for the chapter in Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 1. It says, "It came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I sat in mine house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord God fell there upon me." This was the 6th month of the captivity of a king called Jehoiakim, and the 6th month was the month of Elul. Okay, if you know your Jewish calendar, there you have it. The elders of Judah, they're all there before Ezekiel, and suddenly the hand of the Lord falls upon Ezekiel, and verse 2 tells us, "Then I beheld, and lo, a likeness as the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins even downward fire, and from his loins even upward is the brightness as the color of amber." So a bright yellow, a shining yellow color on the top half. Now, if you just take that verse, you could come away going, well, who is that? Is that an angel? Is that God? Was that an angelic being of some type? But when you get down to verse 17, then he refers to himself and he says that they had returned to provoke me to anger. So then you're going, yeah, that sounds like it's God. And then verse 18 makes it very clear. He says, "Therefore will I also deal in fury. Mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them." So this is a vision of the Lord. And the Lord takes Ezekiel and he takes him to Jerusalem. He takes him to the temple, where he sees some really atrocious, horrible things that had been hidden in the temple area there. So there's our short intro to the chapter. Now let me give you context. As I always tell my church folk, context is everything. You take a verse, you need a context to make sure you understand what the full meaning of the verse is. And we do the same thing with chapters. And so in Ezekiel, we've got what's the context? Well, in the Old Testament, God was dealing with his people, the nation of Israel, and he called them out of the world, and they were to be a peculiar people to him. But there came a time when the people decided that they wanted to have a king, just like all the other nations had kings, and God didn't want them to have a king, but that's what they wanted. So God told Samuel, he says, "Look, Samuel, they've not rejected you. They've rejected me, so you go ahead and give them a king." So Samuel goes out and he finds Saul, and God leads him to Saul, and he anoints Saul. Saul was the first king, and then you had David, the second king, and then the third king was Solomon, and then the nation ends up getting divided into two kingdoms. And during that time period, there were some good kings and bad kings in Judah, in the southern portion, but in the northern portion of the division, it was all bad, all bad. So what did they do? Well, they began to fall into the same kinds of sins of the people around them. They began to worship idols. The Gentiles that lived in the land, they had their idols and their false idolatry, and they instituted temple prostitution. They had fertility rites out underneath the oak trees, and they sacrificed their children to the fire. And so the nation had really begun to reject God. And today, I find that today our society isn't much better. And America calls itself a Christian nation, and we began with some very strong Judeo-Christian values. And I think we're very fast moving away from that. In fact, I'll just say that we've completely moved away from that. But we're not much better. We're just as promiscuous, if not more so. We abort our children. We've limited God to within the walls of the church, and you take God out on Sunday morning, play with him, put him back in his box, and go on about your week. In Ezekiel's time, Israel had already begun to reap the curses of their sin and their disobedience. The northern kingdom, which is called Israel, the southern kingdom, or sometimes Ephraim, and the southern kingdom, which is called Judah or Judea. In the northern kingdom, they were all bad. All the kings were bad. And so in 722, God allowed the Assyrians to come in completely destroy the northern kingdom, take them off into captivity, and they were gone. Now the southern kingdom, Judah, or Judea, if you want to call it that, they lasted a while longer. It's not that they were much better, but they had good kings and bad kings. And because of those good kings, God kind of withheld his judgment upon them for a while. But there came a point where even in the southern kingdom, in the kingdom of Judah, there were just no turning back for them. And so God allowed the Babylonians to come in and take them into captivity as well. Now this happens kind of in three phases with the Babylonians. When the first group comes in, they came in and they took men like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they took them off into Babylon, into captivity. And then when when Judah didn't get the message, then they came in a second time, and on the second group, that's when Ezekiel ends up getting taken. Ezekiel that wrote Ezekiel chapter 8. And then the third group came in the third time. God allows them, the Babylonians, to come into Judah, and they totally destroy Judah's outposts. They lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. They finally destroy the city. They kill many of the inhabitants, and the ones that they didn't kill, they took them off into captivity. And so the time that the Jews spent in captivity is a time that we call the diaspora, which is a big, long, fancy word, which basically means the 70 years that they were in captivity in Babylon. It was a very difficult time. It was a very painful time. 70 years is a long time. There were people born in captivity. They didn't know anything about living in Israel. They knew nothing about the temple that was there, that the Babylonians had literally destroyed down to the ground. They didn't know anything about that. But going back to Ezekiel, Ezekiel is a guy who he knew what it was like before the captivity, and he knew what it was like during the captivity. And so when we get to Ezekiel chapter 8, what is happening here? God is showing Ezekiel a vision of the gross sin of idolatry that was happening in Judah before the captivity. All right? So he takes him in Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 3. The first thing that we see, he takes him to see an image of jealousy. It's called an image of jealousy. I think it's because it provokes God to jealousy. But it says this in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 3. He put forth the form of an hand and took me by a lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. So he's brought there, and then he's taken to the door of the court, and Ezekiel is told to dig in the wall. And when he does that, he finds a secret door. And when he goes in, there's a secret room in there that's built into the temple. Now remember, this is a vision, okay? It's built into the temple. And the 70 leaders, the ancients of the house of Israel, are in there. And lining the walls are all of these idolatrous images. And so in verse 12, it says this, that God charges the leaders with secret idolatry. And it says this, Then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancient of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the chamber of his imagery. For they say, The Lord seeth us not, the Lord hath forsaken the earth. So it's in this secret place that they had painted these pictures of these idols, and they were worshiping them. Some Bible scholars actually believe, and there's some credibility to this, that they brought these ideas of idolatry out of Egypt. They gathered the ideas of other idols from the world around them, and that's what they were doing. I kind of think it's interesting because Egypt is if you study the scriptures, you find out that Egypt is a picture of the world. And when God brought them out of Egypt, he saved them from the world. They were supposed to be different from the world. And believer, you and I are supposed to be different from the world. But I find that in the life of many believers, there is a secret place, if you will, a chamber of imagery, if you will, where we have our own idols, our movie stars or our rock stars or our materialism or our big houses or our fancy cars or whatever it may be. We have our own secret places where we have our own secret sins. And God says it provokes him to jealousy. Now, the prophecy in Ezekiel 8 served as a warning to the Jews that they'd better clean up their acts. They better get some things straight because God was fed up with their hypocritical, secret, idolatrous life. It gives them a clear understanding of their idolatry. What's interesting is the flow of events. In Ezekiel chapter 8, God says, here is your secret idolatry. Then when we get into Ezekiel chapter 9, God gives them a prophetic view of the coming judgment. Here's your secret idolatry. Here's the coming judgment. But they still don't get things straight. So when we get to Ezekiel chapter 10, we read in Ezekiel 10:18, where it says, "Then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubims." God literally left them. He left them. He wasn't done with them, but he removed his hand of protection. He removed his hand of blessing. He removed his power from off them. No more direction, no more guidance, no more provision, all of that. He removed all of that away from them. Why? Because they wouldn't listen to the warnings. The 70 leaders are there. And this is what's interesting, because today we have our own idolatrous private lives, okay? We, meaning many Christians, have their own private lives. And, they have their own secret gods, and, they worship them. And they go to church on Sunday, check, we went to church, we're good Christians, but on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they're worshiping the gods of the world. And nobody can see it. And, they think that all is fine, but God sees it, and God takes note of that. And so in Ezekiel chapter 8, the 70 leaders in Ezekiel chapter 8, they had told themselves a lie. Notice what they said in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 12. They said, "The Lord seeth us not, the Lord hath forsaken the earth." What are they really saying here? What they're saying is, God can't see us. God's blind. He doesn't see what we're doing. God has forsaken the earth. He doesn't care what's going on down here. He's not dead. He's still God, but he's certainly not engaged with what's happening in our lives. All right? And what's interesting about this whole thing is right there in their midst is a man named Jaazaniah, and you find him mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 11. It says, "There stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel, and in the midst of them stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up." Jaazaniah, who gets his honorable mention, if you want to call it honorable, the name itself means God hears. All the while that they were repeating their lies to each other, God had a very strong reminder in the form of a man's name right there in their midst, a priest's name, God hears. Every time Jaazaniah's name was said, God hears. So the men in our text are they're acting religious, but God showed Ezekiel that they were lying about who they really were. Outwardly, as far as anybody could see, they were fine, but inwardly, they were idols. They were idolatrous. They were worshiping idols in secret. And they thought that they were beyond God's knowledge, beyond God's judgment. The nation had some real issues there, some real dirty little secrets, but God revealed them to Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel writes them down in a book. And so now everybody knows, right? Now, having discussed the basic meaning of Ezekiel chapter 8, I just want to end with a couple of points that I think we really need to remember. First of all, you can't keep secrets from God. You just can't, okay? Numbers 32 verse 23 says, "But if you will not do so, behold, ye have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out." Some of us think that we can sin and cover it up somehow, and so the sin will never be known. But God says in His Word, your sin will find you out. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The second thing you need to understand is that God doesn't keep your sinful secrets. He just doesn't. Psalm 50 verses 16 through 21 says this, "But unto the wicked God saith, What hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldst take my covenant in thy mouth?" In other words, why are you talking about me? "Seeing thou hatest instruction, and castest my words behind thee. When thou sawest a thief, then thou consentest with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers. Thou givest thy mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit. Thou sittest and speakest against thy brother. Thou slanderest thine own mother's son. These things hast thou done." And God says in verse 21, "These things hast thou done, and I kept silence. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such an one as thyself, but I will reprove thee, and set them in order before thine eyes." In other words, just because God hasn't done something just yet, don't get the idea that He's not going to. Don't get the idea that He doesn't care. Some people get the idea that since God hasn't done anything, that they're going to get away with it. But don't confuse God's silence with God's indifference, because He's not indifferent to sin. And He doesn't agree with sin. So God's going to judge you. You're not going to get away with it. I like 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 24 and 25. It says this: some men's sins are open beforehand, going before to judgment. In other words, we learn about them beforehand, before the judgment comes. Some men they follow after. Likewise also the good works of some are manifest beforehand, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid. Now, you might be right. You might go to your grave without anyone ever knowing about, your secret sin. But God says that both your good works and your evil works will be open. They will be made manifest. Some in this life, some after, but it will be known. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 says this: be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. So, the harvest is coming. What have you been sowing? God has this universal law, the law of sowing and reaping. Everybody knows it. Even the lost people know this. My mother used to tell me, you're going to get what's coming to you. There is, and my mom wasn't a Christian, but everybody knows that, what goes up must come down. Have you ever heard that? You're going to reap what you sow. If you sow iniquity, you're going to reap corruption. Remember the end of Ezekiel 8, and we'll end with this in Ezekiel 8, verses 17 and 18. Then he said unto me, hast thou seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence, and have returned to provoke me to anger. And lo, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore will I also deal in fury. Mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. In short, if God is speaking to your heart about secret sin in your life, get it right. Because there could come a point where, when God starts to bring his chastisement and you start crying out and going, oh Lord, I'm sorry. It's like my son when he was young, he would do things wrong, and just like any dad, I would punish him. And in the midst of the punishment, my son would be all kinds of sorry. And I'd be like, son, you should have been sorry before the punishment. You should have been sorry before then. And better yet, you should have just never have done it. And so, if you're in the midst of a secret sin, get it right. Get it right, because God wants you to know he knows, and you're not going to get away with it. All right, so that ends this session on Your Questions Answered. What is the meaning of Ezekiel chapter 8? I hope that helps to make the chapter a little bit more clear for you. God bless you, and I hope this finds you walking in the reality of God's presence.